Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest narration of the web series The Survivor Becomes a Dungeon. If you're new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 153, Whitmore Point of View. Before I knew it, what felt like a couple of hours had passed while the kids had decided to take a nap at some point. Whitmore having shifted back into a cup, and the two of them borrowing each of my legs as their pillows. At some point we had finally moved on from talking about Romans and Spartans, as well as the half-truths of my time with Basti and watching the cubs grow up. All this talk of kids and family got Vivian nostalgic enough to tell me of her husband and kids, along with some of little funny stories of her twins' misadventures while growing up, occasionally mentioning Puma as a close friend of the twins and a love interest to Larkus. She often talked about how the two were close and affectionate, but had yet to make anything official, though she also said how it was only a matter of time before something changed between them. When a knock sounded at the door, I was suddenly all too aware of the orange glow of the evening sun that intermingled with the illumination of the crystal lights in the room. As Vivia looked to the door, I could sense that she had a similar realization as she smiled at me. "Looks like time got ahead of us," she mused before looking at the door once more. "Enter," she commanded, while setting down her empty cup of tea back on the table. The maids soon filed in with a few bundles of clothing in their arms, eager smiles all around, as I get the impression that they're eager to dress up Whitmore to see how he looks in proper clothes. Waking the sleeping cub, I eventually managed to get him aware enough to shift back into looking like a beast kid, Whitmore yawning noisily in response while rubbing at his eyes. Despite being rather drowsy, Whitmore surprisingly still had the wherewithal to use his shadows to cover his mid-region, not bothering with my poncho this time, since he could see the maids standing around with the clothes they prepared for him. Watching them dress Whitmore was interesting in itself, since I could tell the maids were used to helping others get dressed, but at the same time, Whitmore failed to grasp even the simplest hints and suggestions when it came to putting the clothes on, since he had no real experience in actually wearing clothes in any way. Regardless, they got him dressed soon enough, and with some light brushing of his hair and tail, I'd say that Whitmore cleans up real well. From looking like the wild child he was, while wearing a raggedy poncho, to now looking properly dapper, if not rather spiffy, I'd say. The maids managed to dress Whitmore up into some slate-grey breeches that had a special gap to accommodate his tail. The sky-blue button-down shirt was rather loose and frilly sleeves, and topped off with a plain black short-sleeved doublet that only goes down to the middle of his upper arm. To finish up his new look, he also had a pair of black leather boots slid onto his feet, though he wore them without socks, since that appeared to be the line of discomfort that he was unwilling to cross. One maid, who looked to be a ratkin, even took the time to brush Whitmore's hair, managing to tame the scruffy and wild look that he had shifted with into something surprisingly presentable as he was left with a neat centre part, his long hair shaping up to be some neat bangs that framed his freckled little face. The hair along the back of his head was also carefully tied up neatly into a short little ponytail. All in all, he looked like a kid off to the Ren Fair to me, dressed in what looked to be a strange and somewhat flashy clothes compared to what I'm used to, even if the colour palette was rather reserved, save for the sky-blue dress shirt. I could tell Whitmore wasn't sure what to make of the clothes he now wore, though it wasn't uncomfortable for the most part, just strange and unusual if I had to put words to what he thought of them. Once he was all dressed up, the maids stood around admiring the handsome little man. One even procured a polished silver mirror so that Whitmore could look at himself over, which he did with great interest. From what I could tell, he was more interested in his face and looks, which made sense, I suppose, since he's likely never seen his reflection before, let alone one of his new face. "What do you think?" I asked, coming up to stand beside him before taking a knee as I looked into the mirror with him. Now that we were side by side, I could see even more resemblance between the two of us. He really looked like he could be my son. Whitmore just glanced between me and himself, though he couldn't help but just smile as he leaned in, gently touching his cheek with mine, as he just admired himself in the mirror, his free hand coming up and gently messing with his bangs. "Yeah, I think you look good. We'll get you more cozy clothes later. But for something they just had on hand, I think you make it work," I enthused while pulling away and gently patting the top of his head. At my reassurance and his head pat, his rounded ears waggled with clear delight as his tail curled and swayed behind him. The maids and Vivia both looked on with interest. Motherly smiles abound as they watched Basmori revel in his new looks, now that he didn't feel like he looked all too weird. It was then that Fraley hopped up from the couch, lunging as she landed on my back while her claws dug into my armored coat to keep herself stable.
"Did I find my ribbon? The green one, remember?"
she asked rather eagerly, though I could sense a small hint of jealousy that Basmori got all the interesting-looking things when she hadn't gotten anything yet. I just chuckled softly at her expense, reaching up and affectionately stroking her chin while touching my cheek to hers. Now, you're asking the wrong person here, and don't forget to be polite," I mentioned while pulling my hand away and looking at one of the maids. Fraley followed my gaze as her feline tail lashed behind me in clear anticipation.
Did you find my ribbon? One that's green like Papa's eyes?"
she asked in a much more gentle manner than before. It was at that moment that I realized that I would have been a real pushover if I had a daughter under my normal circumstances. If I didn't know for a fact that I didn't have any organs due to being made of wood, I could have sworn that my heart just fluttered at being referred to as Papa. The maid smiled warmly as she nodded her head.
"Yes, Miss Fraley, we found one that's as close as can be to your Papa's eyes,"
she said while gesturing to another maid as the woman stepped over and presented a roll of ribbon, unfurling a little for Fraley to inspect. Fraley looked at the ribbon intently, sniffing at the fabric, before humming softly as she looked closely into one of my eyes, and then looking back at the ribbon and studied it again. After a rather long 30 seconds, Fraley finally nodded with clear satisfaction.
"I like it. Make it a nice big bow, please,"
she asked with polite enthusiasm as she impatiently kneaded her claws into my shoulder.
"Of course,"
the maid enthused as they procured a pair of well-made scissors and snipped a cut of ribbon. In the next moment, the ribbon was securely tied around her throat, the bow itself now resting along the right side of her neck as Fraley audibly rumbled with a content purr. After Fraley got to admire herself in the silver mirror as well, there was another knock at the door, causing various ears to perk as Vivia looked at the door and spoke up. "Enter," she commanded ever so casually. At that, the double doors opened, as what I could assume was a butler stepped inside, a dog-kin man dressed in fine livery that was black with greys, which had accents that were deep blue in the same shade as Vivia's gambeson. "Madame Vivia, the feast has started to get underway. Master Trelio has asked me to come and make sure that you and the great mage are aware of this." Vivia nodded some more before looking over at me, a smile now on her lips.
"Well then, shall we go?"
she asked as she stood, taking up her sword and strapping it to her hip, before gingerly taking up my blade and offering it to me. Standing, I made sure to return her smile as Fraley continued to cling to my shoulder, taking my blade from Vivia before sliding it into place on the loop of my belt. "Sounds good to me," I mused cheerfully enough, as I then held out my hand to Basmori, taking his hand in mine, before looking over to my bed. "Come along, Lugosi," I called out, while mentally prodding him awake. The massive wolf let out a noisy yawn as a tail swayed, hopping off the bed and following after me as I followed Vivia out with my children. Chris' point of view. After returning from visiting with Vito, Chris found himself working alongside the adventurers and his team to clean up the inn as well as the surrounding village. There were a lot of little things to be done, such as moving away ruined furniture or clearing up general rubble from the streets and plaza. From what he gathered, it seemed that Vito managed to do a great deal of mage cleanup on his own, so there was less to contend with all around, as it was merely a matter of people putting their lives back together. As the hours go and the sun begins painting the horizon into a beautiful array of purple and orange, Chris watched as some villagers were lighting torches around the village plaza, while the guards and soldiers went around and gathered all the ruined and scrapped wood furniture into a massive pile in the center of the plaza, before setting it alight into a grand bonfire. As soon as the bonfire roared to life, the villagers began to cheer and go full swing into proper celebration, as alcohol, meat, and sweets were brought out from various households and set out on large tables, which were carried into the plaza from the castle itself. Music was struck up from somewhere in the group as the stringed and percussion instruments were played with great vigor and enthusiasm, and it wasn't long before adults and children alike were dancing, chatting, or even singing, as the plaza was illuminated by a mix of crystal lanterns and flame torches. Looking to Sarah, who stood by his side, he couldn't help but smile a little bit at the scene playing out before him.
It's almost hard to believe that the village is nearly razed to the ground and looted for all it's worth. Yet there they are, enjoying life to its fullest.
He mused with a smile, watching Wren play some sort of game with the children of this village, keeping pace with them without any noticeable effort on her part. Sarah returned his smile, hooking her arm around his and bringing herself nice and close to him.
Well, as far as I gathered, they all thought they would die today. To those foreign soldiers, yet despite the overwhelming odds, they only lost 7 people today. Even I'd say there was something to celebrate about,
she mentioned before resting her cheek on his shoulder while watching the proceedings. Chris's tail started to slowly sway and curl behind him as his smile lingered for a while longer.
All I have to say is that it's a good thing that the boss took a liking to us. After seeing what he did that day and hearing about what he did today, I'd say we made ourselves a powerful employer, and, perhaps even a partner.
He enthused to Sarah, even though for Wren and himself he was more of a patron than anything. Not that the others knew anything about that. Sarah nodded slowly, her cheek gently rubbing against his shoulder as she let out a slow exhale.
No kidding. But I still can't help but wonder what sort of work he's expecting from us. He's been keeping his cards really close to his chest, and I haven't been able to get a good read on him.
Chris chuckled at that comment as he glanced down at Sarah.
You, don't know the half of it.
Boss Vito's got an entire deck he's playing with, and we've been lucky to see just a few cards that we've peeked at. Sarah just hummed thoughtfully as they then watched Wither and Blight be crowded by a gaggle of families attempting to force gifts of food and goods onto them as thanks for their help in healing all the injured. And even though Chris couldn't see their faces, he got the vague impression that they were slightly overwhelmed by the attention, not that they hated it. As the celebrations went on, maids and butlers started filing out from the castle bailey, carrying large trays just filled to the brim with all kinds of fancy and even ornate-looking foods. There was even an entire platter filled with what Chris could only describe as a bouquet of colorful-looking fruits, though soon that was followed by soldiers carrying large kegs of some kind of alcohol that was no doubt leagues better than what was already being served. It wasn't long before Wren was running up to him. Yes, she was actually running, with some sort of puff pastry that had some kind of meat filling, and holding it up to him.
Chris, you have to try this,
she said rather excitedly, as her ears waggled so much they looked like they might fly right off.
What is it?
Chris asked with a cheerful smile, taking up the fancy-looking food and looking it over while Sarah pulled away to watch her siblings with cheerful interest.
I have no idea when it tastes so good,
she said while procuring another and taking a big bite. Chris took a bite as well. His own ears started to twitch and sift around as he did his best to savor the flavor of the food. The meat was incredibly tender and moist, yet it somehow didn't ruin the texture of the puff pastry that was wrapped around it. Despite having experience with a good amount of food, he couldn't recognize the meat that he was eating, and didn't dare to hazard a guess as to how expensive the cut of animal or even the monster that this meat could have come from. He was about to comment on the food itself when he noticed what was essentially an honor guard of soldiers escorting Vito and his kids, along with a half-elf, a human woman, and a beaver-kin mage.
Looks like the boss is finally joining the party,
Chris commented with a smile as he popped the rest of the meat and pastry into his mouth.
Hey, who's that kid with him? I don't recognize him,
Wren asked, her ears perked with intent curiosity, while tilting her head at the view.
Ah, that's right, that's his son, Bazmori,
he mentioned with an amused look on his face, relishing the confused expressions of Sarah and Wren as they glanced between him and the child at Vito's side. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Sevaren Serberous, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Light Jock, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Lord Asrical. Thank you very much.